In this video, we're going to provide some details on hierarchical clustering. Hierarchical clustering is a type of clustering that assumes hierarchies among its clusters. So what this means is that we assume that the resulting clusters of the data are subsets of overall larger clusters. This is an example where we have 4 samples. As part of this hierarchical clustering approach, these first 2 samples belong in a single cluster, and then the combination of this resulting cluster with P4 is another cluster, and the combination of all the samples is a large cluster by itself. This hierarchical clustering can be also represented by a tree-like diagram, and we see the one-to-one correspondence between the hierarchies that are denoted on the left side of this example and the hierarchies that are denoted on this dendrogram. So this means that samples P2 and P3 are first clustered together. Then this smaller cluster is clustered with sample P4, as denoted in this part of the dendrogram. And then finally, P1 is clustered as the last sample. The advantages of hierarchical clustering compared to previous non-hierarchical approaches, such as K-means and Gaussian mixture models, is that we do not have to predetermine the number of clusters as we need to do with the previous approaches. And also the resulting clusters may correspond to some meaningful taxonomies. For example, from domain knowledge, we might know that some applications have this type of hierarchical clustering approach, that it is inherent in them. There are 2 types of hierarchical clustering. Agglomerative hierarchical clustering starts with a single sample as an individual cluster and then merges the closest pair of clusters together each time until only a single cluster that includes all the data is left. Divisive hierarchical clustering is exactly the opposite, meaning that we start with a single all-inclusive cluster and then we split the cluster each time until each cluster now contains 1 point. So we're going to focus on agglomerative hierarchical clustering. This contains a few basic steps. As part of this clustering approach, we have a proximity matrix that captures the distances between samples and between clusters. This proximity matrix is updated in each iteration. So every time we have a new cluster, this proximity matrix is updated in order to reflect the samples that belong to that cluster, as well as the distance of the new cluster with the previous samples and the previously shaped clusters. So as part of this approach, we merge the 2 closest samples or the 2 closest clusters together, and then we update the proximity matrix in order to include these revised changes. This proximity matrix is being represented as we see in that right figure here. So in this example, we have an initial set of 12 data points. And as an initial version of this proximity matrix, we compute pairwise distances between those 12 data points in a 12 by 12 matrix. Once we have a few subclusters shaped, so for this case, for our 12 samples, we have these smaller clusters that have been already formed. What we need to do is basically update the proximity matrix so that it reflects these newly generated clusters. So here we see that we have 5 subclusters. Each of the 5 subclusters corresponds to a row and a column of that proximity matrix. And now what we need to do is we need to compute the pairwise distance between those resulting clusters rather than the pairwise distance between those data samples. Once we find the pair of clusters that has the lowest distance, then we can also merge those clusters together and revise the proximity matrix. For example, if we merge clusters C2 and C5 together, we will revise the proximity matrix such as columns and rows that correspond to C2 and C5 are now merged together. And this is the resulting of this merge. As part of this, we also need to update the corresponding row and column so that it now reflects the correct distance between the other subclusters C3, C1, and C4. A key question here is how we can compute the intercluster distance or intercluster similarity, and there are a few ways to do that. First of all, we can compute the distance between the closest samples, meaning if we have those two clusters here, we can just compute this distance, which corresponds to the closest samples. We can also compute the distance between the samples that are furthest from each other, between the two clusters, as well as the average pairwise distance of all the samples that belong to that cluster. This is pretty much a design choice, as well as the distance between the centroids of the clusters. So this video so far has discussed an overview of the hierarchical clustering approach. We will also discuss a small example of the hierarchical clustering approach in the minutes that follow. So as part of this hierarchical clustering example, we have 6 points that are being represented by this two-dimensional plot here. And we also have already computed the proximity matrix, which involves the pairwise distances for all our 6 points. We would like to apply an agglomerative hierarchical clustering using the mean distance as a cluster similarity, the minimum distance as a cluster similarity, which this means that when we are at the point where we have subclusters, what we want to do is compute the minimum distance between the points of these subclusters. So based on this proximity matrix, the first thing here would be to see which is the element that has the smallest distance. So essentially, which are these two samples, which are the two samples that are the closest with each other. And we see that element 3, 6, basically this element here, 0.1, is the one that corresponds to this lowest distance. And we also see points 3 and 6 here. So what we need to do is that we need to merge 3 and 6 together, like we show here, and also revise the proximity matrix. So as part of this revision, rows 3 and 6, as well as columns 3 and 6, will be merged into a single column and row that has these 2 points, 3 and 6. And now we need to go ahead and compute the distance of this cluster with all the other points, 1, 2, 4, and 5. Because we are using the minimum distance as a cluster similarity, it is enough to just go to rows 3 and 6 of the previous matrix and see which of these elements has the closest distance compared to elements P1, P2, and P3. So for example, here we see that P3 to P1 has a distance of 0.22 and P6 to P1 has a distance of 0.23. Therefore, we substitute this first element by 0.22. Similarly, for P2, we see that we have a distance of 0.15 from P3 and a distance of 0.25 from P6. Therefore, we substitute this by the minimum distance. We repeat the same things for samples 4 and 5, and this is now how we have revised this row here and this column here. Repeating the same situation, what we need to do is that we need to find the minimum now of this proximity matrix. We see that the minimum corresponds to element 2, 5, which is the distance between sample 2 and sample 5, meaning this distance here, which is 0.14. Therefore, sample 2 and sample 5 are now clustered together, and we have to revise the proximity matrix, such as now samples 2 and 5 are represented by a single line and a single column. Similarly, we also have to recompute these elements that corresponds to these lines, this line and this column. Again, we see, for example, that the minimum distance from sample 1 to sample 2 is 0.24, and from sample 1 to sample 5 is 0.34. Therefore, this first element here is being substituted by 0.24. Similarly, we do the same substitutions for 0.4, so this is 0.2 because we have this 0.2 here and this 0.29 here. And from this matrix, again, we see what is the minimum distance of 3 and 6 with 2 and the distance of 3 and 6 with 5. The minimum is between 3, 6 and 2. Therefore, this is substituted by 0.15. So at this point, we have samples 2 and 5 together and samples 3 and 6 clustered together. What we need to do is again find the minimum of this proximity matrix. The minimum of this proximity matrix corresponds to this element 0.15, which is the combination of clusters 2, 5 and 3, 6. Therefore, this entire cluster will now become 1. Therefore, all these points here will be now grouped in a single cluster, and we have to accordingly update the proximity matrix. We see now that we have merged those two lines and those two columns and those two lines of the proximity matrix. And now we have to find the minimum distance between this cluster to point 1, which is 0.22. And the reason is that we have had 0.24 between 1 and 2.5 and 0.22 between 1 and 3.6. And also the minimum distance between each of these and 0.4, which is 0.15. We need to repeat exactly the same process a few more times. So again, we find the minimum of this proximity matrix. The minimum of this proximity matrix, as we understand, is 0.15 here. Therefore, we can merge points 2, 5, 3, 6, and 4 in this line. And based on this, we can see now that the minimum distance between these two elements and element 1 is 0.22. Therefore, this is substituted by 0.22. In the meantime, we see that this 0.4 now belongs to a larger cluster that contains all these points, basically this subcluster, this, and this entire thing here. Finally, the last thing that remains is just to merge 0.1. And once we merge 0.1, basically we merge 0.1 that has a distance of 0.22 between this big cluster. And this is a dendrogram here, which is a direct translation of this representation here. So first we merged points 3 and 6, then we merged points 2 and 5. After that, we merged all these together. Then this big cluster was merged with 0.4, and finally this big cluster here was merged with 0.1. This is the end of the hierarchical clustering video.